And so our speaker tonight is Juliana Waters. She's a CRM archaeologist and a master's student in the Department of Applied Anthropology at the University of South Florida. Her research focuses on documenting historic Black cemeteries in Polk County and exploring the socioeconomic and political factors that have contributed to their erasure on the modern landscape. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Julie. So you can take it away.
All right, give me 1 second. I'm having some issues. Sorry, Jamie, I'm having issues.
It's okay. Anything we can help with?
All right, I think I got it working on my side. Can you see it?
Yep, I can see it.
Awesome. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
All right, so as Jamie said, thank you for the introduction. I'm Juliana Waters, and my thesis presentation studied historic Black cemeteries in Polk County, Florida. Before I dive into the research that I've done, I just wanted to quickly make a kind of a note here that this project was completed in partnership with the Leicester African-American Heritage Museum in Bartow and the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and then obviously the University of South Florida, as I am a graduate student there. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with Florida geography, contemporary Polk County is a massive 2,011-mile region. It's bordered to the west by Hillsborough County and to the east by Osceola County. The natural landscape in the region has been historically categorized as prairie, hammock, and pine forest. And these natural landscapes quickly became the focal point of industrial development during the 19th century, paving the way for enormous growth in the cattle, citrus, turpentine, timber, railroad, and phosphate industries, and throughout the county. So before continuing, with the context focused on in this research, I think it is absolutely critical to acknowledge that Polk County is native land, meaning that this area and the areas beyond the boundaries of contemporary Polk facilitated the lives of Indigenous people for thousands of years prior to Indigenous removal. And in fact, during the very violent periods of Indigenous removal, the area between the Peace and Withlacoochee River comprised a portion of the 40 million acre reservation that Indigenous people were forced onto during the 1800s. And this slide also features a poster created by Florida Public Archaeology Network and the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and it brings attention to the decade-long efforts calling for the return of 1,496 ancestral remains that are currently being held by the Smithsonian Museum. If you're interested in learning a little more about the hashtag campaign, you can visit the links on this slide from the Seminole Tribe of Florida's website, the Seminole Tribune, National Park Service, and Florida Public Archaeology Network's Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act page. So switching context just a little bit, over the last decade or so, Black burial ground destruction and erasure have become a rather well-acknowledged injustice in what is historically known as the Jim Crow South. And you'll hear me use this phrase, Jim Crow South, a few times throughout this presentation. And I'm basically just referring to the states in the South or Southeastern US that had Jim Crow laws. In the Tampa Bay region alone, we're currently witnessing these immense efforts to acknowledge, document, and memorialize, as well as legally fight to alter the course of contemporary destruction that's impacting these cemeteries. And while media and local governments are just now bringing these issues to light for the public, Black people and Black communities impacted socially and legally by the legacy of segregation have been making the same effort for decades, calling attention to the injustices and underrepresentation and destructions that are relative to their heritage sites. So throughout this work, this is one lesson that has continued to ring true. And it is that these spaces were never intentionally abandoned, and they have never been actually lost or forgotten about for those that are connected to them, and whether that's descendants or members of the local community. And on this slide, you can just see a few of the many headlines that have come out in just the last 2 years alone about this issue. And I need to add that this is not just a Hillsborough County or Polk County issue, and it's not just a statewide issue. This is happening everywhere, and it has been happening everywhere for a very long time. So before we get into my research, I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page with what some of the terms in this presentation mean. So you'll hear me talk about the Florida Master Site File, or as it's typically abbreviated on the slides, it'll be FMSF. So the Florida Master Site File is basically just the official state list of cultural sites, and this includes cemeteries. GIS is essentially just fancy maps with extra information. And then the acronym WPA stands for Works Progress Administration, which you will hear a little bit about in like 2 slides from now. Just a bit of background on how I really got into this work. In the early months of 2020, I was working on an African-American cemetery recovery project in Jacksonville, Florida. And I was working as an archaeological technician. This was my first interaction with cemetery erasure or destruction. But this scenario exemplified the gaps and biases that currently exist in our preservation system. And it really highlighted the lack of effort, especially at the state level, for assuring that historic African-American cemeteries are preserved and memorialized. So what essentially happened was a company had been contracted by the Florida Department of Transportation, and they were supposed to use a specific piece of land for fill dirt with the intention of laying it down over this newly constructed overpass. And now this particular stretch of land was once owned by the Broward family, who were prominent figures in the Florida timber industry. And sometime between then and the early 20th century, it became a segregated cemetery called the Eastport African-American Cemetery. The area that this burial space was located in had been surveyed before, but apparently they couldn't locate it. So they had a cultural resource survey done here by archaeologists, and they could not find the graves. The site was also not listed in the Florida Master Site File. The city of Jacksonville had noted that there were no graves at the cemetery, although they did have record that there was a cemetery there. But upon actually removing the fill dirt and placing it along the overpass, the construction crews uncovered human remains, a headstone, and coffin hardware from the cemetery. So they called on us as archaeologists to go in and try and recover those remains, and there was many of them. So this was really my first up close and personal experience working on a project within this context as an archaeologist. And I remember very well a coworker looking at me while we were screening through these like massive piles of fill dirt and saying, this is probably one of the most important projects that any of us will ever work on. And at that time, most of us working this project were absolutely exhausted. It was the beginning of COVID, so things were already crazy. And it was on top of it, just an insanely emotional experience, and quite frankly, just disappointing and angering to see that this destruction of the cemetery was a result of our own shortcomings as a discipline and as a state that supposedly places an emphasis on preserving history. And that statement made by my coworker still resonates with me to this day, because he was absolutely right. Physically recovering what was supposed to be the final resting place of this community was a huge motivation in completing the research that I have for this current project in Polk County. So like I said, that was a huge motivation. The Eastport African-American Cemetery project is something that will always stick with me. But that, coupled with everything else that's gone on in the last few years, like the rediscovery of Zion Cemetery and all of the memorialization and efforts that are happening, all of those instances really exemplified the gaps and inconsistencies in our preservation efforts and our policies and methodologies, both of the past and of the current. And my absolutely amazing advisor, Dr. Diane Wallman, connected me with Becky O'Sullivan and Jeff Motes at FPAN in my first semester of grad school. And Becky was working on this extensive GIS database. And if you'll remember, I said fancy maps with lots of extra information. And the GIS database mapped the cemeteries in Florida that had been listed in the WPA Veterans Graves Registration Archive. If you don't know what this archive is, during the 1930s, the federal government had sponsored programs in an effort to alleviate the nationwide unemployment. And one of the many programs consisted of a state-by-state documentation of grave locations for veterans. So luckily, the WPA employees also documented cemeteries that did not contain veteran burials. They provided some really great geographical and landmark features as references to navigate to the burial grounds that they recorded. And while the landscape has changed significantly in most of Florida since then, as most of you have seen, it is an excellent resource to use just to get you in the general vicinity. But moving forward, if any of you are doing this work or are thinking of starting to do work similar to this, just keep in mind that this program did end prematurely. It resulted in the exclusion of 15 counties from the final published archive. So that means that only 52 of Florida's counties are published. So Becky was in the middle of putting this together and using the archival information. She essentially produced like initial hypotheses about the status of the cemeteries in the archive throughout the state. And she tried to determine like which sites still needed to be documented in the Florida Master Site File. So each cemetery was categorized based on the available information, such as located, needing more research, or potentially erased/destroyed. And upon meeting Becky and Jeff, they so generously allowed me to kind of take part of this database and narrow down the focus for this project to one county. Then they gave me the freedom to kind of decide what the next steps would be, with the ultimate goal of getting these cemeteries documented in the Florida Master Site File, officially making them part of Florida's historical record and recognized at the state level as cultural resources. So every project begins with questions, research questions in particular, and as most of you may already know that, my first question really was about the role of archaeologists and anthropologists in all of this. So how do we prevent further loss and destruction of these spaces? While I'm positive that there's not a single solution or a single answer, there are a few wonderful examples present on this slide. Here we have the Florida Historical Cemetery Form. Anybody can access this, and there's also a guide on the Florida Division of Historical Resources website. If you want to record a cemetery, your first step would always be to try to submit an inventory with the Florida Historic Cemetery Inventory, and that is a partnership with the Florida Division of Historical Resources and Florida Public Archaeology Network. So your first step would be to see if it's already in the site file, and if not, this is your next step. There's also the Black Cemetery Network, which was founded by one of our department members here at USF, Dr. Antoinette Jackson. And that essentially records the stories of these cemeteries and establishes contact points for each burial ground that's logged within their network. And then there was the Abandoned Cemeteries Task Force. This began in, I think it was 2021, around August, and they had finally submitted, after a lot of work, a final recommendation report to the state of Florida. And unfortunately, there's been some issues, and I think it was the last 3 weeks, the House bill that they had proposed or put together, the recommendations, ended up dying on the House floor. But I know that this fight is going to continue, and that the lovely people that are on this task force will not allow this bill and the work that's been put into it to die. So to go on to my next question, I really wanted to research or establish an understanding of the more specific patterns in folk that ultimately resulted in emissions of these cemeteries. And then I wanted to recognize how those specifics are entangled with the deep history of segregation and marginalization in Florida, or more broadly, the Jim Crow South. So with those research questions in mind, the overall research goals for this work began to multiply. And the first was to assure that Polk County's historic cemeteries were documented in the Florida Master Site File. And this is just a map of what was in the site file and documented prior to my project. So I wanted to use this compilation of information and model a step-by-step kind of guide or framework that helped people identify, locate, and document historic African-American cemeteries on a county scale. It's probably one of the most important aspects of this research, or one of the most important goals, because as you may know, getting these sacred sites properly documented means getting involved in a huge undertaking And it can and should be pursued by any person that's interested or passionate about it. So by producing a guidebook that's readable and usable, not only for scholars and those in heritage preservation, but for community members and descendants and the general public, it's just so important. And then finally, this is a more theoretical aspect of this work, but narrowing this overall focus to the county level really helps to pick apart the more specific causes of destruction and erasure, and then kind of plug those back into a broader historical moment of Jim Crow segregation in Florida, to see not only the differences, but the similarities in some of the patterns that have already been established in other parts of the state through similar work. So while similar work is being done throughout Hillsborough County, per se, the two counties have drastically different histories and drastically different sets of circumstances as far as development and urbanization are concerned. So being able to recognize those differences and then identify how they both fit into the same picture of intentional and unintentional destruction, and how they're tied to Jim Crow history as a state and as a region, is pretty important. And while I can't give you all of the nitty-gritty details of Polk County history, I can give you a brief summary of how or why Polk County's population grew so extensively from the 19th and into the 20th century. And the main answer to this is industry. So post-Reconstruction, we start to see this shift in Polk from cattle to this larger reliance on citrus and turpentine and lumber. And around the same time, we also see the discovery of these extensive phosphate deposits in the Bone Valley region. And if you've ever driven through Polk County, you can see some of these mines that are either still active, or you can drive by like the massive flooded mines that are now reclaimed land. It's pretty wild. But these industries and the migrations caused by them, along with the development of brand new road systems, eventually resulted in the county being referred to as Imperial Polk County. So it becomes one of the richest counties per capita in the nation, propelled by the laborers of these industries, and many of whom were Black individuals or families that migrated south in search of employment or were brought down by the convict leasing system. And the convict leasing system was a result of the extensive and oppressive Black codes upheld continually that were funneling free labor in the form of human beings into the state and into the county. It's worth mentioning that many of these camps had very specific living conditions, and I mean many, but not all. But by that, I also mean in the form of payment. So if workers were receiving it, it was probably by script, and this script could only be used at nearby company-owned stores within the camp. So these already marginalized and segregated communities that are trying to navigate this post-Reconstruction and Jim Crow landscape socially, legally, and physically were intentionally being positioned within this system at many of the camps. And this situation very much mirrors, the antebellum plantation system. And historically, these segregated Black communities were at the whim of company owners and landowners who maintained their employment, but had intentionally positioned them in this never-ending loop of reliance and having to remain transient as the companies would deplete the resources and sell their land and move on to the next stop along the way. So my methodology going into this project was constantly expanding as I learned to really navigate historic resources, and my understanding of community outreach and engagement also grew. So I began mostly looking at the WPA archive, double checking all the location directions for the burial ground and trying to make sure that I was looking through as many historic maps as I could find as possible. And just looking to see how the landscape had changed from then until now. And then from there, I started to locate more archival information like Sanborn fire insurance maps, plat maps, and just a quick note, those are not super useful when you're looking in rural areas. So Polk County was still pretty rural at this time, and Sanborn fire insurance maps and plat maps did not necessarily apply. But I also looked at property records such as deeds, newspaper articles, historic literature, historic aerials, and burial records. And unfortunately, we had absolutely no luck with finding burial records or burial permits for most of these cemeteries. Now, my initial goal was to compile as much information as possible on the cemeteries, just to figure out what their what their status was prior and what their status is now before going into the field to try and confirm it. And honestly, one of the most helpful resources during this process were these really well-detailed books that were created by the Imperial Polk Genealogical Society. Basically, the Genealogical Society had published 9 cemetery books, and they did this around the 90s and early 2000s. And they retraced the steps of the WPA employees in the 1940s. So the books contained some historical background information, updated locations, the cemetery conditions, and if possible, the names of those that were interred. And while both the Genealogical Society and I encountered some of the same issues, although decades apart, it was still a really great resource that filled in so many of the gaps for the burial grounds that existed because the WPA archive was so long ago. In addition, I was incredibly lucky because I had the opportunity to partner with the Leicester African-American Heritage Museum in Bartow throughout this project. The operations and programs manager, Adrian, and director, Mr. Charles Lester, were so beyond supportive of this work, and they promoted it through the museum and within their communities, and they brought as much attention to this effort as they could to create a space for people within communities to come forward and offer information on these cemeteries if they wanted to, which several people did. And this actually added cemeteries to our list that weren't present in the WPA archive or the IPGS cemetery books. So following the accumulation of info and continuous community outreach that Adrian and myself were doing, we ended up trying to locate the cemeteries in person. So we would go into the field. We would pick any day of the week. Her and I would get our field clothes on, and we would drive around Polk County and get out and walk around and pedestrian survey, pieces of land to try and see if we could find any semblance of, or footprint of, or mark of a cemetery. And if we were successful, we would photograph and speak with local members of the surrounding communities, churches, and organizations to gather their personal knowledge, complete the cemetery forms for the Florida Master Site File, and then go back and upload that all into folders. And I would create shape files in GIS, the fancy mapping system. And then finally, my final step in this process was that I actually didn't plan to do this in the beginning, but it just kind of happened. I set out to photograph and complete cemetery forms for as many historic cemeteries, or just cemeteries with historic sections in the county, as I could. So each one of those also received photos and maps and shape files and submission into Florida Master Site File. Altogether, by the time that we were done accumulating background and archival information, we had heard from several community members, and we had a total of 17 cemeteries that were hypothesized to have been potentially erased or destroyed. And based on archival resources and community outreach, 8 of these were historic white family cemeteries and 9 were historic Black cemeteries. So to better evaluate the processes that led to the potential destruction or neglect of these cemeteries, I wanted to see if similar scenarios had impacted the historic white family burial spaces within the county. All 8 of the white family cemeteries were recorded in the archive, the WPA archive, and the IPGS cemetery books. But one significant difference between the processes of evaluation between the 2 types of burial grounds was that there were considerably more resources available that detailed the history of those cemeteries and the communities that were connected to them. It also detailed, prior locations, any destructions that may have happened, any relocations that took place, and it also gave information on the fact that the cemeteries that we thought were destroyed actually had permission to be moved. And we were able to double check that by going to the cemeteries that they were saying they were moved to. And that same privilege was not afforded to the historic Black cemeteries that were looked at in this thesis. So the results of this research really suggest that historic Black cemeteries in Polk are disproportionately impacted by destruction and erasure. Of the 9 historic Black cemeteries that we looked at during this project, 5 were erased or destroyed between the early to mid 20th century through various means. And this ranges from the purchase of land by the federal government, or bombing range development, or airfield development. It can be land acquisition for agriculture, or even phosphate mining. Whereas the white family cemeteries that were included in the analysis were either being preserved in their original locations or relocated with the permission and blessings of the family and descendants that were connected to them. And one particularly striking example of this is the preservation of this cemetery called the Pelham Cemetery. And it is a small family cemetery. It is in southern Polk County, and the land that it is on is owned by Mosaic. And the cemetery is in absolutely incredible condition. It's fenced in and tucked away beneath the shades of these enormous oak trees, and across from it is like a small grass road and then a huge flooded mining pit that's now considered reclaimed land. And it's examples such as this that really make you stop and question why the historic cemetery a few towns down the way was mined over, or how the unmarked historic Black cemetery on what was recently acquired land by Mosaic was supposedly moved, yet there exists no documentation for that action. So all in all, just a quick little summary of what I did with all of the Florida Master Site File documentation. I ended up submitting 60 historic cemeteries or cemeteries with historic sections to the Florida Master Site File. These were photographed and mapped and then documented, and I had background histories gathered on them. And now a few slides back, I mentioned that one of my research questions and goals was to better understand the causes of erasure in Polk County. And as we started gathering information on historic Black cemeteries, there was a common theme that began to emerge. So the majority of the historic cemeteries were active between the late 19th century and early 20th century, and during segregation in Florida. Nearly all of them were a byproduct of industrial intensification and segregated community development as Polk's turpentine and lumber and citrus and phosphate industries began to boom. So these segregated communities were forced to the outskirts of their work camps and towns, and legally and socially banned from attending church with their white coworkers or burying their loved ones in the nearby white cemeteries. As a result, they created their own churches and cemeteries within their own communities. In many of the scenarios, these segregated communities were at the whim of the business owners and their decision to keep or sell the land once the resources were depleted, or they were offered a huge sum of money from phosphate companies, land developers, or even the federal government. As I mentioned before, while not all turpentine or lumber communities had dealt with the same issues as far as form of payment was concerned, many of them were intentionally positioned socially, legally, and economically to have to rely on this transient industry to maintain their livelihood at this time. Not to mention that they legally were not seen as owners of the lands that their own communities and cemeteries were on. So many of these communities were stuck within this system that was intentionally modeled, like I said, after antebellum plantations, and relied on a cashless form of survival through scripts that could only be used at their company stores. So I kind of covered the basics of my research and the history of why this is so important. And now I kind of want to show you 3 examples of the cemeteries that I worked on. And while this won't even like scratch the surface of the incredible Black histories that took place on Polk's historic landscape, I hope that these examples do offer a glimpse of what can be learned when studying cemeteries. So I was beyond privileged to be given the time and granted this opportunity to compile these histories. And if I'm allowed to pick a favorite experience from my thesis work, the story and experience behind trying to find St. Mary's African-American Cemetery would be the one that I would tell a million times over because it was just such a special moment. So throughout this work, Adrian and I encountered a lot of dead ends while looking for archival resources that actually acknowledged the existence of these historic Black cemeteries and even the communities that were associated with them. And St. Mary's African-American Cemetery was no exception to this. So we had compiled and extrapolated what little we could from the archival resources, and we found one historic aerial. And we went into this kind of like, okay, we don't know a lot, but we're going to try and figure it out. So we had hypothesized that this area was the general vicinity of where the cemetery was located. And quite honestly, based on the name, we had assumed it was associated with the Black community church. So with that in mind, Adrian and I had headed towards the town of Frostproof to look for this site. And as we approached, we started to take note of the acres of citrus grove that were just consuming the surroundings. And we came to a stop at our pinned destination, which ended up being a florist shop. So both Adrian and I were sitting in the car kind of hesitant because the door of the shop was open and we didn't know if the shop owner would want us to bother them. But we eventually, I guess, decided to get out. I don't even remember us deciding, but we decided to get out of the car and approach. And as we hesitantly went towards the door, we were greeted by who we would come to find out was the first Black florist in Frostproof, Mrs. Gardner. And after she listened to our fairly chaotic and fairly nervous speech about why we were approaching her property, she interjected us and started talking about her history at the property and her family's history at this property. So throughout this conversation, we had learned that Mrs. Gardner and her family grew up here working for the Lat Maxi Corporation in the surrounding groves. And Lat Maxi was a huge name in citrus in Polk County. So Mrs. Gardner told us stories of her climbing these enormous oaks on the property and playing with the children of the seasonal camp. And as it turned out, these camp workers would come down every year for picking and packing, and they would come from Georgia. So these seasonal families were part of the segregated community, and they lived in cabins to the west of the property. Now, we didn't realize that's what these were, and they're kind of hard to see, so I apologize because the image is so faint, but it is also from the 40s. But these yellow circles here are the cabins that she was talking about. And if you look at the black and white area, you can see it. Mrs. Gardner then told us about her father's cemetery, which he had named after his sister Mary. Her father would allow the community members to inter their loved ones on this property because they were not allowed to bury in the white cemetery up the road. She said that she did not remember the burials being marked, and that by the time she was a teenager, that it was no longer active. And at this point, Adrian and I are just completely fully engulfed in this conversation, and we're sharing glances back and forth, just in like absolute awe of all of the information that we had just learned, because it was entirely absent from the archival resources. And in the midst of this like overwhelmingly personal conversation about her childhood and raising her family there, and emphasizing to us how much this land means to her, Mrs. Gardner glanced down at this concrete slab in her front yard, and we were standing on this. I don't even remember how we got to it, but we were standing on it. And she said, "And this was my daddy's juke joint." And that day we had set out to locate a cemetery. But we walked away from this interaction and connection with Mrs. Gardner with a brief and personal history of an entire community. And the cemetery area is pictured up here to the left. And the juke joint platform is pictured here on the right. So she shared with us personal stories about watching the adults of her community through the windows of the juke joint growing up until the building structure was damaged by a Polk County sheriff's officer pursuing someone on a high-speed chase. And I guess her father had asked the sheriff's office to repair the building a couple of times, but nothing ever came of it. And it eventually resulted in the demolition of this very important cultural space and place of memory. Mrs. Gardner had also tried for years to keep the cemetery area clean, but had recently suffered a stroke, leaving her unable to keep up with the overgrowth. As you can see, it's like pretty overgrown. I would have shown a picture of the inside of it, but you really cannot see much. But this experience was such a defining moment during this research because it emphasized to us that although documents and archives led us to dead ends, that these spaces are not lost or forgotten by community members that are connected to them. And this experience also reinforced our understanding that talking with community members is like of the utmost importance. So kind of shifting to the next example, Lake Garfield African-American Cemetery in Alturas was actually learned about through those Imperial Polk Genealogical Society cemetery books. And this cemetery sits within a citrus grove. It's pretty incredible. Through the years, even in the historic aerial, the boundaries of the property have remained the same, which is great. This particular burial wasn't listed in the 1941 WPA archive, but a generous community member named Mr. Dudley actually reached out to the museum to share information with us after he saw a Lakeland Ledger article about this project. And based on the information from Mr. Dudley and from those cemetery books, and also from the property appraiser and this historic aerial, we were able to piecemeal some of the story behind the cemetery together. And as it turns out, this sacred space was created and used by a segregated Black community that worked for E.T. Rue's timber and crate operation in the Lake Garfield area. And E.T. Rue is also another huge name in Polk County, and I also think Plant City. And the community had not only created the cemetery as a place to bury their dead, but had constructed a church on the western edge of the property. And it is really hard to see. I apologize for that again. Historic aerials are very hard to look at sometimes, but that is the little area where the church was. And we later realized that the platform could be seen in the very pixelated historic aerial from 1958. So E.T. Rue had employed around 120 people for about 10 years prior to selling the land and leaving the residents of this community no choice but to leave their church, cemetery, and homes behind. And there are an estimated 80 to 100 burials within this overgrown cemetery forest, or within the overgrown forest that's consuming the cemetery. I mean, I would show you a picture of it, but there really is no point because you can't see anything. However, when the IPGS had visited the site during their survey in the 90s, they were able to locate a handful of headstones. And obviously, decades later, when we visited, it was very overgrown. We were only able to find a single headstone, and it was very clearly out of place, sitting out in the open. You can see it right here. And after Adrian had spoke with Mr. Dudley, we learned that the reason for this misplaced headstone was likely due to an attempt at theft. Supposedly, they believe that the stone was carried from its original space in the overgrown woods and left out here in the open, just beyond the tree line, because it was too heavy. So, like I said, the circumstances that this community faced seem to be a common fate for many of the historic Black industry communities in Polk. On a different note, a little more positive, I guess, in the last few days, we received a message through the museum from the current landowners who are looking to legally sign over the cemetery property because they want it recognized and properly memorialized. And while Adrian and myself cannot assume ownership of this space, we were able to let them know that it is now documented in the Florida Master Site File, recording it officially as part of Florida's historical record. And then my last example from this research involves a turpentine camp and a bombing range, which from a distance, turpentine and bombing ranges probably seem like two very different entities that have nothing to do with one another. But in this case, the two could not be more intertwined. So some of you may have heard of the Avon Park Air Force Range located in southeastern Polk County. And in 1928, the US government purchased approximately 106,000 acres of land for the formation of this bombing range. Prior to this purchase, it was a huge turpentine camp operating from 1919 to 1928. And it was a main settlement along the Kissimmee River Railway that connected logging and timber towns to the Seaboard Airline Railway. There was an estimated 187 Black community members living within the segregated confines of the camp. So 43 out of the 53 dwellings here were segregated Black households. 3 were Black dormitories, there was a church, a school, and even a juke joint. And the location of the still and peripheral areas have been surveyed multiple times between 1985 and 2013, with the most recent documentation being done by Deborah Zeal in 2013. And she's also an archaeologist. She graduated from the University of South Florida. This was her master's research. And she used artifact scatters throughout the remnants of what was the turpentine town of Nalaka to reconstruct the landscape. So additionally, the segregated cemetery made and utilized by this community was recorded in the 1941 WPA archive. So the pattern of forced abandonment that I've been talking about also applies in this scenario where these communities had to follow along with the movement of these huge industrial companies as mill operations moved around the county, exploiting whatever remained of longleaf pines. And while this is still a military base to this day, we were able to briefly connect with the base archaeologist, Kathy Couturier, who said that she actually knew of the cemetery's general location and had plans in the works to locate it. Due to access issues, obviously it's a military base. Adrian and I were not able to physically go look for the cemetery. And as you can see here, this historic aerial is less than helpful. You are not going to see a cemetery in that. But we made do with what we had, and Deborah Zeal's work was an incredible resource for trying to figure out the story behind this. And based on this information and the results of the archaeological reports, this pretty massive turpentine community has a lot to offer Florida's historical record. And while the potential location of the cemetery is now recorded in the Florida Master Site File, I am hopeful that there will be future work done within this context, and it will lead to a more representative reconstruction of the immense contributions of Black communities that built up what eventually became known as Imperial Polk County. So just to conclude, I wanted to offer a few of the outcomes and recommendations moving forward. As I've mentioned, one of the broader goals of this work was to create a reproducible framework for others to work from. And with the support and help of Rachel Kangas at FPAN, I'm currently working on putting together a guidebook that will be publicly available for anybody who needs some help along the way in their approach to similar work. Additionally, I'm working on having the historic African-American cemeteries from this research documented in the Black Cemetery Network, and also working to compile and organize this information for communities that may be interested in trying to have these recorded as historic landmarks as a form of acknowledgement, protection, and documentation. And finally, one of the most important suggestions that I could ever make based on this research is that counties work to create better local ordinances that will continue to memorialize and uplift spaces, in addition to establishing a plan for perpetual care and rehabilitation. Before I leave you all, the Leicester African American Heritage Museum and I have put together a cemetery cleanup day at Bartow's Evergreen African American Cemetery. So it is this Saturday, starting at 8 a.m. and going until 2. We're basically preparing the space for the placement of a historical marker next weekend. And if you're interested in participating, I know that the CGCAS field trip is this Saturday as well. But if you're interested in participating in this and would like to be sent the details for the event, you can either scan this QR code and it will link you to it on Facebook. You can email me and I will send you the information, or you can look up the FPAN West Central Facebook page and the event is also on there. I would like to thank Becky O'Sullivan, Jeff Motes, and Rachel Kangas for their help, support, and guidance in completing this work. In addition, I extend my never-ending gratitude to Adrian Kearse, Charles Lester, and Dr. Harvey Lester of the Leicester African American Heritage Museum, the Bartow Historical Center, community members Carolyn Gardner, Dudley Putnam, Otto Brown, Katrina McCutcheon, Tanya Ayers, and Benjamin Link for their contributions. And finally, I want to thank my incredible advisor, Dr. Diane Wallman, and committee members, Dr. Antoinette Jackson and Dr. Thomas Placon.
Julie, thank you so much for sharing your research. Absolutely amazing work and just such an important contribution to our history here in the Tampa Bay area. So thank you for that. And just for the record, I won't be offended if you choose to go to the cemetery cleanup instead of the CGCAS field trip to all of our members out there. So if you have any questions for Julie, I think it's easiest if you type them in the chat so we can just kind of stay in order. I already have some coming in. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them away.
Sorry if my audio was choppy at any point there. I apologize for that.
It wasn't too bad. Don't worry about it. So one of the first questions I got was, what is a juke joint?
So kind of like a club, playing music on the jukebox. People would get together either at night or on a weekend and they would enjoy themselves. A communal space.
Cool. And then someone was interested in the idea of the heirs property and how that may have contributed to the loss of these cemeteries. So that so many members of a family owned land that developers could take advantage of that and force a sale after having secured like a small share of the whole.
Let me see.
So that was a DM.
Oh, okay. I have to look up the answer to that question. I apologize, but if the person that sent you that wants to email me, I will definitely try to figure out the answer to that and email them back at any point in time.
Thanks. Barbara was interested in if you've spoken to Cantor Brown, because he knows so much about Polk County.
I haven't spoken to him personally, but his 2 books were like the most excellent resources for constructing my background history chapters of my thesis. So it's done some great work.
It looks like some people are interested in your contact information if you wanted to share that in the chat, like your email. And then Rachel was interested if you could talk a little bit more about how someone would get started in researching cemeteries in the area.
Yeah, of
Or in
course.
their area.
Your first step is definitely going to be submitting an inquiry to the Florida Division of Historical Resources and FPAN's Historic Cemetery Inventory. You want to find out if the cemetery that you're looking to document is already listed in the Florida Master Site File. And then if it's not, you can go from there, start looking. If you know where it's at, you can go fill out the site form for it, gather the background information, and then submit it. Or, if you don't know where it's at, you can try to take the steps to find it, which is looking through archival information, and then going from there.
Awesome. And do you know about how often FPAN or other organizations do cemetery cleanups?
I think COVID kind of impacted that, but I think they just had one. So I think it's picking up again. I would keep an eye out. And if you're not aware of the CRPT Alliance Facebook page, I will type that in the chat, and then I will try to find a way to link it really quick so that you guys can join it.
We have someone asking, why did you choose Polk County?
Okay, so I was looking at the database that Becky had created with Becky, Jeff, and my advisor, and we had actually looked at Polk County and Pasco County. But I live in Pasco County, and I was like, you know what? I don't know anything about Polk County, and there's a lot that looks like it needs to be done there. And so I picked Polk County. And now I'm in love with it, so
Awesome. And yeah, it looks like there's just a lot of interest in talking to you more. So there's some emails in the chat. Julie did post her email for those who are interested, Juliana 14. And is there any other questions?
You guys can literally ask anything you want. I will try my best to answer it.
I think it's just because you did such a great job explaining everything.
I hope so.
Oh, here's one. Is there anything to be mindful of when looking for cemeteries?
Yeah, absolutely. Private property is a huge thing to be mindful of. There were plenty of spaces in Polk County that Adrian and I could not access because they were on private property. And Polk County is the last place that you want to invade someone's privacy in. So yeah, that's one thing. But the other thing is, just be aware that these cemeteries are connected to real people and real communities while you're doing this work.
Okay, now we've got a few more coming in. Is the Polk County government assisting with any cemetery recovery?
As far as I know, not right now, but I'm hoping to do some future work with that.
Have you had any resistance from the surrounding community?
No, I haven't. Luckily, I'm sure that no community is a monolith. I'm sure that there will be somebody somewhere along the way that is not necessarily happy with it, but not so far.
That's good news.
Yeah, for sure.
Are there any other areas outside of Polk County that you'd want to work on next? What else is on your list?
Oh gosh. I'm not sure. Yes, obviously, I love doing this. It's incredible. But I have no idea where I'd want to work next. I feel like Polk County, there's so much to still be learned. So there's just a lot there that still needs to be done.
We have a question asking if you have any recommendations for GIS software for noobs.
Oh gosh, no, not like software in particular. I used ArcGIS and then relied really heavily on YouTube tutorials to get me through this. and it was definitely rough.
Yeah, there in ArcGIS is also a lot of money for non-students or academics. QGIS is free, but I mean, I think there's a steep learning curve. Google Earth might help you, but as far as getting historic aerials, it might be a bit difficult to get into Google Earth.
Yeah. Are they trying to access historic aerials? Is that what they said?
They just asked for good GIS software for noobs for cemeteries.
Okay, got it.
And then were any of the forgotten cemeteries still being tended to by one or two people? Did you find any pebbles on the headstones or flowers?
So for the cemeteries that we looked at, there was one in particular that was moved. And this is the Gordonville Cemetery, and it eventually became the Good Hope Cemetery. That was being tended to, and it's in amazing condition. There were no like pebbles on the crypts or the headstones there, but we did see quite a few of them in, I think it was Bowling Green African-American Cemetery. That was really cool. It was beautiful.
And Heidi Miller asked that, so she said that you hypothesized 17 forgotten cemeteries, but you submitted documents for 60 cemeteries. What is the total number of forgotten cemeteries that you discovered?
So so the 17 were the hypothesized, the 60 were just the compilation of that 17 plus all of the other cemeteries that have like historic sections or are historic in Polk County. So I had decided like mid-research that if I was doing this for 17, I might as well just do it for all of them or all of those that I could find. And that's how that panned out.
And then Stephanie would like to know, or she said, my family's house is on Wallace Road in Alturas. Is that where Lake Gartella is?
Yeah, that's where Lake Garfield is actually. Yep. It's in the middle of orange groves.
Awesome. And that looks like all the questions. So thank you again, Julie. Awesome job.
Thank you all for coming so much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Our next lecture won't be until September, so we'll see you then.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.